The thing that is hard to see is all of the rest of the reality that surrounds the visible, that is made accessible by art and our experience of it. And that's what we're going after in the interpretive endeavor. Welcome to Ostracon, a podcast that translates fragments into the whole from which they came. Well, today we're talking about, why am I doing this? It's a question you may be asking. If you don't like what I'm doing, you're probably definitely asking it. It's a question I'm increasingly asking myself. And I've tried to gather my thoughts into some kind of a position of what am I doing here. I think there's two important aspects to that question. The first is, why am I doing it in this way? The second would be, why am I doing it at all? So I'd like to begin with, why am I doing it this way? And most of the thought in that regard relates to the literary theory and the general view of art and what it means about us and what it means for us and what we do with it, because that perspective then extends outward into the interviews and the other fragmentary questions that are also under the umbrella of this podcast. So let's begin with the basis for my theory. I think it's important immediately to recognize the importance and influence of Jacques Maritain on the way that this project views art. And his work provides a philosophical and even, you might say, theological basis for some of what we're doing in several ways. First, he provides an articulation of the relationship between beauty and art. And the idea that art is beautiful because it's a participation in the beauty of the divine. That it is part of our nature as being in the image of God, that like God, we are creators. And that in our art, and this is not exclusive to any person or any idea, we're all imbued with this status as creator, even co-creator with a capital C, and that the work of art really is bringing something into existence out of nothing and taking part in the creative act that brought life and identity, virtue, love, and I include in that also the laws of the intelligible universe and science that brought all of these things into existence. And we continue that generation out of nothing in art. So that tells us something about who we are, and it tells us something about what art is. Art is beautiful because it is a participation in the source of beauty. Things in art that are beautiful are true because they are a participation in the source of truth. Maritain is very clear from his perspective that nobody is perfect. No artist is perfect. It doesn't take a perfect artist to access truth. In fact, quite the opposite. Sometimes talent abides in unexpected places, and truth comes to light in strange and experimental and contrary ways. But that's because of the nature of art and existence, not necessarily because of the merit of the artist, though the artist certainly has to have raw talent. Maritain also provides the basis for thinking about poetic knowledge, the idea that not all truths can be articulated declaratively or expositively, that there are truths that can be recognized as true, but are conveyed in the form of beauty alone and not in words. And art holds this privileged place of conveying these things that we know in our heart to be true when we see them, even if you couldn't speak them. And that's why we say right in the statement of what we're doing here that we conduct the analysis of the art that we're looking at, or the other questions or life experiences that we're looking at. We conduct the analysis in order to open up our perception to what they are and what they have to say. But then this makes it possible to go to the next deeper level of poetic knowledge and to look at these experiences, paradoxes, examples of beauty, and to take them into ourselves in a deeper and inarticulable way, which elevates the soul. We're going to put a link below to a book about the philosophy of Maritain from the perspective of a poet, which is a very interesting inroad into some of this thought. What are some of the other bases for my theory? Well, I accept the idea that a text or otherwise a piece of art exists in the communion that it forms with a reader-viewer. The text or the piece doesn't do anything if it's just closed up in a cabinet somewhere. The text does not spring entirely from the reader either. The idea is that there's a gap between them that must be bridged, and meaning and truth are discovered in the bridging of that gap, in the communion between the two. And that's what we're endeavoring to do in this interpretation. It is a merger of horizons. Now, there's a potentially contrary strain of thought that really what we should be doing is just determining what the author meant, that the dignity of the author or artist requires that we be focused on what they meant. Otherwise, you're instrumentalizing them for another purpose. Two responses to that. First, I think it's fair to note that literary theory has left this view behind long ago. There are many different perspectives, systems, in some cases you might even say ideologies, that all do the same thing that we are doing here, which is bridging the gap with a piece of art, merging horizons, and coming to their own theoretical conclusions. But I think that you can address this other line of thought in other ways too. First of all, I think there's a difference between meaning and truth, or there can be, and that it's possible to be fully respectful of an author, to desire to know them as an individual and to understand their meaning, and at the same time to merge horizons with the piece of art and thereby discover the truth that it conveys. Art can convey a truth that was not intended by an artist. So I think that there is space to give dignity to the artist and their talent and their meaning, and also to engage in an interpretive and theoretical endeavor to find the truth that is conveyed in the art. Now, going back to where we began, what makes the endeavor of this podcast different from any ideology that would just pick up a text and read it through the lens of an ideology? If you will come along so far as to posit that there is a divine and that the nature of the divine is true and that it influences the nature of existence, then when you bridge that gap in the interpretive process, you are encountering something that is authentically and actually true, not just what a reader or viewer might wish the text to mean for purely material purposes. And that is Maritain's point, that art is beautiful because it is a participation in the giver of beauty, and it is the truth that is in it that is beautiful. So where does that leave authors? Authors are real. I don't deny the author. But I think that the text or the work stands independent of author or creator, because the thing that makes the work beautiful may be different from what the author intended. Now, if you're going to ask from that, what is it that makes you think that Christianity, or specifically Catholicism, is particularly true or beautiful? I can't do all that work in this one episode. In some sense, that's the endeavor of this podcast, in that engaging in this practice of theory and interpretation, that compelling beauty can be found, that it compels the heart, that there is something real and true here because of the beauty that we can perceive in these pieces. Or otherwise, you should talk to an RCIA or an OCIA program to start exploring the historical, theological, philosophical, personal, experiential bases for the faith. Returning to theory for now, interesting to me also is that theorists have put forth the idea that the gap between the reader and the text is necessary for good writing, that defamiliarization, violation of expectations, is what makes for constructive reading, or, put in my language, communion. Wallace Stevens said, poetry should make the visible a little hard to see. I think in the context of this endeavor, I would interpret that to mean not that we obscure things, but rather that poetry reveals, or art in general reveals, how enormous are the truths of existence that get squished down into rote observation. In other words, reveal the actual mystical nature of the things that we think we know. Reveal that there are hidden things in them yet to be found out. So it's not really, although I appreciate the pithiness of what Stephen says, it's not really that we're making the visible hard to see. It's that we're showing that the visible is not the entirety. The thing that is hard to see is all of the rest of the reality that surrounds the visible, that is made accessible by art and our experience of it. And that's what we're going after in the interpretive endeavor. It is interesting, post-Enlightenment, that you have the rise of sort of secular scripture, in that people seek a heightened, transcendent human experience in our art, even as the world pursued a false dichotomy between reason and faith. But the point is that the human heart longs for truth and seeks it by all these roads: reason and art and exploration and experience, and what the church preserves to us as revealed by God. These are all roots of hunger, and they all lead to the same place. Sometimes you can even see in the interpretation of art the same thing that you do in great myth, that there is a truth that the human heart recognizes or remembers and is after it in the most dramatic or illustrative ways available to it, even in paradoxes or poetic knowledge. To the extent that you might think in terms of setting up a center in order to structuralize everything around it, then what we know about ourselves and the world based upon the identity of Christ would be that center, which then would give structure to the art under interpretation. While it's true that you can have a center anywhere and build a structure around it, all the centers can't be equally true. any center might have some degree of truth that can be found, but different centers would have mutually exclusive conclusions, and two mutually exclusive things can't be true at the same time. And so once again, we're going to have to refer to things outside the bounds of this particular episode to start asking questions about how do we develop a hierarchy of truth. But I think for the point of an interpretive basis, that's the basis for this center and the structure that it creates around it. Like Pascal famously said, his faith was the only thing that allowed him to make sense of the world and why we find ourselves here, in the strange mix of promise and peril, virtue and beauty and brokenness that we find all around us. To the extent that theory sees language as sort of the fabric of existence, language maybe even as our own source, or language as the thing that is coming through in the text and that we're actually trying to get back to. The search for a source, the search for an unreachable desire, or a source of all other signifiers or images that we use in our art. I do wonder if their search to understand the endeavor of art and the nature of the text and our distance from it and how it's understood, I do wonder if it doesn't push them towards a quest for some kind of a prime mover. And if the mysterious language behind the text isn't just the word, as in the logos, the creative mind that orders existence. Certainly we use narratives, language, to define ourselves, our history, our identity, and to order our lives. So I feel that part of the power of art is that it's using the raw materials of ourselves, the raw materials of identity, for its own brand new creation ex nihilo. But that also suggests that these raw materials are a real thing that come from somewhere and give us a consciousness of ourselves and a communion with one another. To the extent that literary theory or interpretation occurs in a community, then I think that this endeavor has a community in the collected teachings of the church over the last 2 millennia. While I think what this podcast is doing is unique in its platform and in its approach to all these diverse pieces of art and experience, it doesn't stand alone. It stands against the whole history of thought springing out of the identity of Christ. And to the extent that this theoretical endeavor forms a system, it is that system. And the interpretations that are offered here can be judged in the context of that system and their consistency with that system. To the extent that communities are part of the creative process, then I refer to the indelible mark that Christian thought has had on the history of the world and to the beauty and dignity of the individual that it instills, which is the basic assumptions and oftentimes the inspiration of the art that we're looking at. I also recognize that we live in a time and a place where the pressures of consumerism, the pressures of commodification can attempt to commandeer art for their own purposes. They can be commandeered by the commercial. And in this endeavor, I wish to subvert that, to subvert the disposability of emotion and experience. And you do that by recognizing in the art its eternal and lasting qualities, that it is something that transforms you and remains with you, that it is not something disposable, and it cannot be commandeered or transformed to the purposes of the commercial. One may even question whether we live in a time where it's not just art, but even ideas, creeds, identities can be commoditized or subject to commoditization and put into niches. And so, having talked some about my theoretical basis, I move on to two other topics briefly as to why I do this way, and that's the need for the humanities and the basis of shared experience. So I'm doing this way in reference to art and experience because we need the humanities. We are at a precipice where our technology allows us to do so much, and perhaps even allows us to avoid so much, that we need the humanities to get back to a basic understanding of ourselves so that from a first principles endeavor, we can make judgments about how to proceed, how to use the tools available to us, what it is that we're supposed to do. One example doesn't cover the whole field of experience here, but it is merely an example. If a student can use an LLM to generate a term paper, the solution to that is not an arms race with better and better LLMs for the teachers to ferret out who's creating their term papers with AI. The solution to that is a return to the humanities. It's a return to the human values as to why we want to learn anything at all, what it means to be a whole person, and how do we pursue it, and why should we want to pursue it. That's the thing that would invest a student then in the pursuit of knowledge and the generation of original ideas. But all of these things are first principles concerns. And so that's another reason why I do this in the form that I do it, to return to those first principles. I also mentioned shared experience. We have to realize that despite all of our differences and our wonderful diversities, we are motivated by a lot of the same things and the same values. And in a time when we may be facing increased commodification of even ideas and identities, at a time when we may be facing increasing polarization, we have to talk to one another in a shared endeavor seeking the truth. And we have to start from the basis of shared experience. There is no other way out. And so the art and the searching and the questions that we try to engage here are that common ground out of which we can build something together, mutually, respectfully. Thinking back for a moment to literary theory, to the extent that it's necessary to have a shared canon in order to bridge the gaps between art and the reader and viewer and their experiences, I would submit that shared canon is the shared human experiences, not necessarily a canon of particular expressions thereof. It's the longing, the hope, the sacrifice, the virtue, out of which we are making a life, and all of which is tied in one way or another to our identity in the image of God. And these things that we share allow us to merge these horizons and access these truths interpretively, while at the same time, I hope, emphasizing our closeness and even intimacy with one another. So then let me say a word about the interviews, which also include these sort of authentic seeking questions that appear in the fragments, which are kind of I don't know, maybe an interview of the listener or an interview of the self. Why do those two and not just focus on the art and the theory or the interpretation? The reason is that the interviews too, and some might feel the interviews especially, also explore and bring to light the majesty and the mystery of the human person that is discoverable through our lived experiences, what we do, how we work, what we've seen, and our different perspectives on some of the same questions, conundrums, and points of awe and amazement. For many of the same reasons I've already identified, we need a place for respectful and honest dialogue with one another. This obviously isn't the only place, but I hope to make it a place for that, where we can mutually seek after things together and from our different experiences. The interviews allow us to explore with diverse people and to recognize the transcendent qualities of their work and all our work, what we do, what preoccupies our mind and our time, what is the nature and the value of our craft. And all of this confirms the identity of the individual that is lived in our work and experiences and stands against their commodification. The work that we do and the way that we make our art is an expression of who we are. It is an actualization and a realization of human identity. That's what it's meant to be. To express in it the creative and profound image in which we are made. That's why labor is treated with dignity. That's why work is good. That's why persons should not be commodified. And exploring all of our different work helps us to find these shared truths. So I've talked at length, probably too long, about why I'm doing this way. I guess that leaves the second, shorter question I identified, which is, why am I doing this at all? Well, I'm doing it in part because of what I understand to be Catholic, which means universal. The idea that there is a truth for all diverse peoples of different times and places. And I'm trying to find, as I was saying earlier, a platform to bring together diverse views and perspectives in search of something that is universal. I'm doing it because there's a need for the gospel. The gospel provides hope and identity in a situation that intrinsically calls for hope. It expresses even, I think, that hope should exist. If you look back through history at the various hopes that were held by peoples of all times and places, but it's also a situation that might very easily be hopeless if there's not a compelling basis for hope that we can explore together. And so this is an opportunity to find the gospel in a place and a way where we can have free discussion and exchange of ideas, and to try to share with others through shared experience what I find to be compelling. And going back to Pascal earlier, what is it that makes sense of this situation in which we find ourselves? I'm doing it because there either is a God or there isn't. And if there isn't, then I'm lying to myself and I'm fooling myself, but I would also be left in an existence that has no credible explanation. On the other hand, if there is a God, and if God really is the source of all of the things that we've been talking about, as my human experience suggests to me God is, well then, we would owe God everything. It would be a truth that was so good that it must be shared. You know, in many ways, it would be much easier to stop short in these interpretations or in these interviews and not to push forward to the final level of inquiry, or not to push forward to the final root of Christ in the things that we observe. It would be, I think, easier, and perhaps sometimes even easier to receive. But if my interpretations stopped short of God or faith or Christ, then they would in fact be less broad and less true. Sometimes I would like to stop an interpretation at, this is a search for truth. This is a form of beauty. This is a way to view the human person, but to not bring it down to first principles, to leave it open. But then really, you're stopping short, because what does all that compel you to? What is the next step that those things suggest? I'm doing it because I want to take the next step and go all the way and identify it. The point is not to ask great questions together and not answer them. Certainly, we ask questions together with one another and in support of one another, but the purpose of asking is to find. The purpose of seeking is to find. The purpose of knocking is to open a door. So I'm doing it this way because the great questions that all of these pieces of art and shared life experiences raise should be traced down to first principles. To be honest, I don't always want to do it. To be honest, I feel as though I've had some of my strongest personal attacks of doubt since I started this endeavor. There's a part of me that thinks that suggests that maybe this is something good. And that's why what lives in the fall dissuades me of it, or tries to. And by the way, that's not a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's not a feedback loop where doubt is more reason to believe. To the contrary, it's an occasion for continued dialogue. It's an occasion for a return to reason and beauty that kindled a fire of belief in the first place. And so while that's not why I started this, it's part of why I'm continuing, at least for now, because I'm also trying to get at the truth too. And this is part of my own dialogue with our history, with the great minds of the past and the present. So far, those are my reasons for doing this and why I'm doing it the way that I am. I'm sure they'll develop over time, and we'll see what the future holds.